Do you intend to be an eyesore forever, or will you finally conform to this neighborhood? Barked a voice so smug it could curdle fresh milk. I hadn't even taken a sip of my morning coffee when I opened the door to find a woman standing on my front steps in a red blazer, a gold name tag, and holding a clipboard like it was a divine artifact. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't smile. She didn't even blink. She just waved a thick packet of papers at me like I was a criminal who'd skipped town and dared to return. Her entire demeanor screamed suburban dictatorship, and I stood there in my boxers and a Star Wars t-shirt wondering if I had accidentally trespassed onto a movie set. She pointed at my wind chimes, scoffed at my rose bushes, and accused me of violating half a dozen code infractions before I could even say my name. The twist? I didn't even live in her HOA. It all started 3 weeks after I moved into the property. The house belonged to my late uncle, a reclusive inventor who left behind a legacy of weird patents, 2 cat-shaped mailboxes, and a yard that was half botanical garden and half mechanical scrapyard. I loved it. It was weird, it was quiet, and best of all, it was mine. No mortgage. No rent. Just me, my tools, and a few ambitious landscaping projects. I hadn't noticed the little HOA sign down the street because, well, it didn't matter to me. I'd looked over the zoning maps before buying and saw my property line ended a solid 5 blocks before the HOA jurisdiction even began. So when the clipboard crusader arrived at my door, I was completely blindsided. I asked her who she was. She blinked like I had just insulted the Queen of England. I'm Karen Witherspoon, president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, she said like it was supposed to strike fear in my heart. She began flipping through the pages of her packet, reciting infractions like she was reading scripture. Your mailbox is non-conforming. Your front garden contains unapproved flora. You've got an unauthorized sculpture. I looked at the sculpture. It was a life-sized metal rooster my uncle welded from old bicycle parts. Its head spun when the wind hit just right. Honestly, it was majestic. I interrupted her halfway through the list. I'm sorry, Karen, her eyes twitched when I used her first name, but I'm not part of the HOA. She froze. For a moment, I thought she was buffering. Then she straightened her back and looked me dead in the eye. That's not how this works. Everyone in this neighborhood must comply with HOA standards. I laughed. Like, out loud. That's cute. But this house isn't in your neighborhood. I told her again that the property wasn't listed in the HOA registry. But she shook her head, waved her hand like she was swatting a fly, and said, that may have been true once, but our board voted to expand oversight. Your house is now under Willow Creek jurisdiction. We sent out notices. I asked her to show me this magical vote and notice. She told me it wasn't her job to educate me and that ignorance doesn't exempt you from the rules. Then she shoved the packet into my hands, turned, and walked off down the driveway like she'd won. I stood there, speechless, staring at this thick pile of threats, citations, and, my favorite, a fine schedule that ranged from unauthorized pavers to holiday light abuse. I wasn't even sure what that last one meant. I spent the next hour digging up property records, HOA boundary maps, and zoning laws like my life depended on it. I even called the county office just to double-check. The verdict was crystal clear. My house, lot, and every last square inch of the land was completely outside the HOA. In fact, it was part of a separate land grant from 30 years ago that was never absorbed into any residential development. My uncle had even fought to keep it that way. No HOA dues. No board oversight. No suburban overlords with clipboards. What I realized next hit me like a freight train. Karen didn't make a mistake. She knew. She absolutely knew I wasn't part of her neighborhood. But she still marched onto my land, tried to intimidate me, and dumped this packet of threats in hopes I wouldn't know my rights. This wasn't enforcement. This was an attempted power grab. She wanted my land to fit her vision. And she wasn't used to hearing the word no. So I decided I wouldn't just ignore her. No, that would be too easy. I was going to lean in. I was going to pretend I believed her, play along just enough, and see how deep this rabbit hole went. If she wanted a game, I'd give her one. But I wouldn't be the one getting played. The next morning, I mowed my lawn into a spiral pattern just to be obnoxious. I added more wind chimes. And I placed the metal rooster front and center with a new sign that said, HOA mascot. Sure enough, she came by again. Didn't say a word. Just stood on the sidewalk with her clipboard, trembling with barely contained rage. I waved. She stormed off. What she didn't know yet was that I wasn't just some clueless new homeowner. I worked in civil infrastructure as a consultant. I'd helped rewrite zoning maps. I'd advised municipal boards. I once lectured at a state conference on overreach by homeowners associations. Karen had just picked a fight with someone who not only knew the law, but helped write parts of it. And I was just getting warmed up. This wasn't going to be a simple disagreement over landscaping. This was war. Clipboard war. And Karen had no idea that she'd brought HOA rules to a legal demolition derby. By the time the second week rolled around, Karen had shifted from hostile neighbor to full-blown menace. I started noticing things on my property that hadn't been there before. A neon orange notice of non-compliance sign had been zip-tied to my mailbox. A soggy printout of Willow Creek's HOA guidelines was left under my windshield wiper like it was a parking ticket. Someone had even placed a laminated list of acceptable lawn ornamentation in my flower bed, complete with arrows pointing to my gnome statues labeled Remove. It wasn't even subtle anymore. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules, she was trying to psychologically bulldoze me into submission. What she didn't realize was that I wasn't playing defense. I had been quietly preparing a little counteroffensive of my own. First, I made copies of my property deeds and zoning records and placed them in a plastic weatherproof display case right on the edge of my front yard with a cheerful sign that read, "Not part of HOA, but thanks for the suggestions." It had a QR code too. If anyone scanned it, it led to the county's GIS system where my lot was clearly marked outside Willow Creek's jurisdiction. I figured if Karen wanted to make this public, I'd save her the trouble. But Karen wasn't done. She stepped it up by trying to bring in her army, starting with the neighborhood. A few days later, I noticed a group of HOA members walking past my house in a tight cluster. Karen was leading them like she was the head of a weird little suburban cult, pointing to various objects on my lawn and murmuring in hushed tones. I stayed on the porch and waved. "Y'all want lemonade or just here for the self-guided rage tour?" I asked. No one responded, but I could see some of them fighting back smirk. One of the women in the back looked downright embarrassed. Karen shot her a glare, and the woman looked away like she'd been scolded. The next day, a formal invitation was stuffed into my mailbox, an HOA meeting scheduled at the Willow Creek Community Center. I wasn't technically a member, but I had a strong suspicion my name would be mentioned. I showed up early with a Tupperware of brownies and a folder full of documents. The room was already packed with residents sitting in metal folding chairs, fanning themselves with HOA newsletters. Karen sat at a long table in front with two other board members, neither of whom looked particularly enthusiastic to be there. She spotted me instantly and narrowed her eyes. "This is a members-only meeting," she snapped as I walked in. "I brought brownies," I replied with a grin, placing them on the refreshment table. That earned a few chuckles from the crowd. I wasn't going anywhere. Karen cleared her throat and launched into a speech about neighborhood cohesion, aesthetic standards, and preserving property values. Then she pivoted hard. "We have a situation," she declared, as if announcing a natural disaster. "A homeowner has chosen to disregard our standards. Despite repeated notices, there has been no effort to conform. This threatens our community integrity." She didn't say my name. She didn't need to. Everyone turned and looked at me. I stood up, calm as ever, and walked to the front. "Hi everyone. I'm Alex. I just moved into my uncle's old house. You might have seen the rooster out front." A few people laughed softly. Karen didn't. I've been getting notices from your president here. Citations, warnings, fines, threats of legal action. There's just one problem, I said as I opened my folder and pulled out the map. I'm not part of your HOA. I turned the map to face the audience and tapped my finger on the thick red line. My property ends here. Your jurisdiction ends here. There's a big gap in between. Karen tried to interrupt, but one of the board members leaned forward and asked, "Can we see the zoning certificate?" I handed it over. The room went quiet as the papers passed down the table. Then someone in the back stood up. An older man with silver hair and a USMC cap. "He's right," he said. "I've lived here since the neighborhood was built. That house was never part of the development. Old man Whitaker fought like hell to keep it separate. Said he didn't want anyone telling him where to plant his tomatoes. That was the tipping point. The room started buzzing. People were whispering, looking at each other, murmuring things like, "I didn't know that, and she never mentioned that." Karen tried to salvage the moment by accusing me of exploiting a loophole and benefiting from HOA-funded services. "Like what?" I asked. "Your street sweepers don't even come down my block. I pay for my own trash pickup. And don't get me started on the pothole outside my driveway." She had no answer. She glared at the board, expecting backup, but they stayed silent. One finally said, "If his property's not included, we shouldn't be issuing notices. That's a liability issue." I looked Karen dead in the eye. "Maybe next time you decide to go on a citation spree, you should check your boundaries first." Literally. I left that meeting with a smile on my face and a plate of my own brownies. On the way out, one of the younger residents caught up to me and whispered, "We've been dealing with her nonsense for years. You're the first person who stood up to her." Another guy gave me a fist bump and said, "That rooster rules, man." But Karen? She wasn't finished. The next morning, I found a handwritten note taped to my window. It said, "This isn't over." I could practically see the indents where she'd pressed the pen down in rage. I smiled and poured another cup of coffee. She didn't realize she was trying to fight a war with someone who already knew every inch of the battlefield. She'd made a mistake, not just in trying to bully me, but in thinking I was alone. She'd stirred the neighborhood too hard this time. Now eyes were opening. Whispers were spreading. Her armor of control was cracking. And I hadn't even started the real fun yet. The next few days were strangely quiet, and for a brief moment I wondered if Karen had finally backed down. There were no more bogus notices, no more cult-like walking tours by my garden, and no more aggressive printouts stuffed in my mailbox. It felt wrong. Like the eye of a storm. That eerie calm that only meant one thing: she was planning something worse. I wasn't wrong. On the 5th day, I returned from the grocery store to find a thick envelope taped to my door. No postage, no signature, just a red-stamped label on the front, Willow Creek Enforcement Package. I didn't even need to open it to know it was another dose of HOA lunacy, but I did anyway, mostly out of curiosity and popcorn-worthy entertainment. Inside were printed photos of my house from various angles, including zoom-ins of my mailbox, my front porch bench, the wind chimes, the rooster, and even my trash bins. Each had notes scribbled in red marker underneath like a deranged teacher grading a failing student's science project. Non-standard placement. Unapproved decor. Violation of uniformity standards. The most absurd was a picture of my dog lying under a tree with the words, "Improper pet containment. I live on private property with a fence." I mean, really? It didn't end there. There was a typed letter stapled at the back warning that continued violations would result in financial penalties and a potential lien being placed on my home. That was when I stopped laughing. A lien? That wasn't just bluffing. That was a legal threat. Karen was no longer playing games. She was pretending to be a government entity and threatening seizure over arbitrary rules she had no authority to enforce. That was crossing a line. And now it was my turn. I didn't waste time. I called my cousin Eric, a real estate attorney with a specialty in property dispute. Eric was the kind of guy who could spot a fraudulent clause from a mile away. I sent him the photos, the letter, and the fake violation list. His response came back within the hour. This isn't just nonsense, it's actionable. She's impersonating legal authority, attempting coercion, and possibly committing civil fraud. You want to press her? Let's draft something real. The letter we put together wasn't flashy. It was firm, direct, and terrifyingly precise. It stated clearly that I was not under the jurisdiction of the Willow Creek HOA, that their president had repeatedly issued false citations, attempted harassment, and made fraudulent threats involving a lien. It cited local statutes, property law precedents, and even quoted the very county zoning ordinance that exempted my parcel from any HOA interference. The closing line was a beauty. Further unsolicited contact or false documentation will be considered grounds for a formal harassment complaint and may result in civil litigation. The next morning, I printed that letter and had it notarized at the bank. Then I made 6 copies. 1 for Karen, 1 for the board, 1 for the city council liaison, 1 for my records, 1 for the neighborhood Facebook group, and 1 for fun. I laminated that one and nailed it to my fence. I slid Karen's copy into a pristine envelope with a small sticky note on top that read, as requested, "Enjoy." I dropped it off at her mailbox and walked away, not even turning to look. I didn't have to. I heard the shriek later that afternoon. A deep, primal, angry walrus kind of shriek. It echoed across the cul-de-sac like a siren. I peeked through the window and saw her pacing in circles on her front lawn, phone clutched in one hand, my letter flapping in the other. Her husband, a quiet guy with a permanent look of regret on his face, just stood by the garage like a statue. But Karen still wasn't done. 2 days later, she went nuclear. She sent a mass email to the neighborhood. I only saw it because a neighbor forwarded it to me with the subject line, "Karen's meltdown, LOL." The email accused me of exploiting a jurisdictional technicality to destabilize the community. She said I was taking advantage of resources without paying dues, benefiting from proximity to Willow Creek while refusing to respect its culture. She called me a non-compliant free rider and warned everyone to avoid engagement with me until I chose to assimilate. Yes, assimilate. Like this was a sci-fi dystopia and I had refused to join the hive. I wasn't going to respond directly. But I wasn't going to let it go either. So I made a new sign for my front lawn. It was tasteful, wooden, and painted with elegant calligraphy that read, "Proudly not HOA approved." I hung solar fairy lights around it and planted wildflowers at its base. Then I pulled the biggest move yet. I invited the entire neighborhood over for lemonade and barbecue. Not a formal party. Just a casual Saturday afternoon hangout. No RSVP. Come as you are. Kids welcome. Gnome photo ops optional. I wasn't sure who would show up, but they came. First in trickles, then in droves. Families with kids, couples with folding chairs, retirees carrying trays of cookies. Some even brought their own coolers. People wandered into my yard, complimented the garden, took selfies with the rooster, and asked questions about my wind-powered sprinkler setup. One guy brought his guitar. By sunset, it looked like a full block party, except it was only on my side of the line. Karen stood at the edge of the sidewalk for 10 full minutes. Just stood there, watching. I saw her mouth moving. She was talking to herself, fuming like a teakettle on high. But she didn't step foot on my lawn. Not this time. She knew she couldn't. That night, one of the HOA board members, Sandra, I think, came by and gently knocked on my door. She looked both amused and exhausted. "I just want you to know," she said, "not all of us are like her. A lot of us are tired of it too." I nodded. "I know. That's why this wasn't just for me." She smiled, handed me a slice of cake, and walked away. Karen's tactics had failed. Her threats had backfired. And her grip on the community was starting to crack. I wasn't the enemy. I was just the first one who had the nerve to say no, and now others were starting to remember what that word meant. But the best part? Karen didn't realize that she had left a paper trail so thick and incriminating that the real reckoning hadn't even started yet. Her war was built on fake authority and thin paper. Mine was built on law, fact, and patience, and I had plenty of all three. Karen was unraveling, but instead of backing down, she doubled down with a desperate fury. Her once carefully crafted image of composure and leadership was cracking, and the fragments were flying in every direction. She started posting in the Willow Creek Community app nearly every hour, issuing vague warnings about external threats to neighborhood stability, clearly referring to me. She introduced something called the Conformity Initiative, a proposal for new bylaws that would fine any resident who visibly collaborated with non-compliant parties. The wording was so bizarre and dystopian that it felt like she had binge-watched a dictatorship documentary and taken note. But the real problem wasn't the nonsense rules. It was that she still had some loyal supporters on the board, and they were letting her push it forward for a vote. So I decided it was time to speed things up. Karen wanted control. I was going to give her chaos instead. I pulled out a binder labeled Uncle Whit's Legacy Projects, which held all the weird ideas my late uncle had never finished. One of them was a half-constructed Kinetic sculpture made of bicycle chains and metal tubing that he'd intended to place in the front yard but never quite finished. I decided to complete it. I spent a few evenings welding, hammering, and retrofitting it with motion sensors and solar-powered LED light. When it was finished, it looked like a gleaming metallic tornado that spun when people walked past and glowed purple at night. I placed it right at the edge of my property, facing the street. It became an instant sensation. Neighbors came by just to watch it spin. Kids were mesmerized. Even the local art teacher asked if her students could sketch it for a project. Karen, of course, lost her mind. She sent a complaint to the city zoning office alleging that I had installed a rotating hazard in a residential area. Unfortunately for her, the city zoning officer was not only familiar with my property but was also the guy who had signed off on my exemption years ago. He laughed when I called him. "You're outside the HOA. You could put a neon dancing Santa in July and still be in the clear," he told me. Karen received an official notice from the city a week later, clarifying that her complaint was not only invalid but bordering on harassment of a private resident. She didn't post in the app for 2 full days after that. It was the closest we'd gotten to peace since this madness began. That weekend, I hosted what I called the conformity-free celebration. It was part barbecue, part block party, and entirely legal. I set up a small stage in my yard, invited a local high school jazz band, arranged games for the kids, and even had a corner where people could decorate tiny wooden lawn gnomes however they liked. A neighbor brought a popcorn machine. Someone else brought a cotton candy cart. The turnout was massive. Over 70 people showed up, many of whom hadn't even spoken to each other in years. It was like the whole neighborhood had been holding its breath under Karen's rule, and now it could finally exhale. Karen watched it all from her window. I knew because I saw the blinds twitch every few minutes. At one point she stepped outside, clearly about to storm over, but she froze when she saw how many people were laughing, talking, and actively enjoying themselves. She knew she couldn't interrupt it without looking completely unhinged. So instead, she did what all tyrants do when they lose control: she spun a story. By Monday morning, she had posted a long rant on the neighborhood app accusing me of orchestrating a subversive event designed to erode community trust and destabilize the HOA. She claimed I had lured children onto my property with illegal attractions, created hazardous noise levels, and endangered public safety with my sculpture. She even said someone had seen me giving out political pamphlets, which I assumed meant the laminated zoning map I had placed near the lemonade stand for laugh. But this time, the reaction wasn't what she expected. Comments began pouring in under her post. One neighbor wrote, Karen. My son had more fun in Alex's yard than he's had in 3 years here. Maybe that's not the crisis you think it is. Another wrote, You mean the music and games? That was the first time I saw our neighbors smile. Sorry, but this is over the top. Someone else added, I brought the cotton candy. Should I turn myself in? It was glorious. Then came the tipping point. One of the board members, Sandra, the same woman who had brought me cake weeks earlier, posted a screenshot of Karen's original violation letter to me, complete with the fake fine schedule and the threat of a lien. Her caption read, For those wondering how this really started. This letter went to someone not under our jurisdiction. We've allowed this to go on too long. That post spread like wildfire. More neighbors joined in, sharing their own stories of petty citations, forced repaintings, and mysterious fines. One guy revealed that Karen had fined him for improperly stacked firewood. Another said she was warned for putting out Halloween decorations too early in October. That night, a group of residents called an emergency meeting. I wasn't invited officially, but I didn't need to be. People kept texting me updates. By the time the meeting was over, the board had voted to suspend Karen's powers temporarily pending an investigation into misuse of authority. She reportedly screamed for 5 straight minutes and had to be asked to leave the room. Sandra took over as acting chair and immediately issued a statement apologizing to the community and clarifying that I was never under HOA jurisdiction. She even thanked me for reminding us what true community looks like. The next morning, a new sign appeared at the HOA's message board near the entrance to the subdivision. It read, Respect, kindness, inclusion, no more fear. It didn't name Karen, but it didn't have to. The message was clear. Her era was ending. I spent that afternoon finishing up the paint job on a new gnome statue I had started carving the week prior. This one wore a little crown, carried a clipboard, and stood on a tiny pedestal labeled Retired. I placed it right next to my spinning sculpture and smiled. Karen had tried everything. Petty fines, legal threats, public shaming, and all she did was unite the neighborhood against her. She had underestimated the power of decency, and she had completely misjudged her opponent. I wasn't trying to destroy her little empire. I just refused to kneel to it. And that was enough to bring the whole thing crashing down. But the funniest part? The gnome wasn't even the finale. That was still coming. Because Karen didn't know that someone had forwarded all her letters, threats, and fake notices to the county ombudsman, and they had some questions. Serious ones. The kind that came with subpoenas and hearings. And the last thing she'd be able to do was control the narrative once the law started knocking on her door. The silence that followed Karen's suspension wasn't peace. It was the tense quiet of a shipwreck waiting to sink. People walked their dogs with lighter steps and waved to each other more, like they were shaking off years of tension they hadn't realized had built up. But beneath the surface, everyone knew the show wasn't quite over. Karen wasn't the type to let go quietly, especially not when her authority had been publicly dismantled and replaced with community goodwill and spinning yard sculptures. She'd gone from self-appointed queen to isolated exile in a matter of days, and something about that didn't sit right with her. It didn't take long before she made her final, most absurd move yet. A letter came in the mail with a city seal on the envelope. At first I thought it might be from my cousin Eric forwarding some update from the county investigation, but when I opened it, I realized it was a formal municipal complaint filed by Karen herself. She had attempted to accuse me of operating an unlicensed event venue, and claimed that my community gatherings posed an escalating hazard to neighborhood order and pedestrian safety. She actually listed her own HOA as a concerned municipal partner, despite being officially suspended from the board. She even claimed I'd violated electrical ordinances with the solar-powered gnome display. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the letter in my fire pit. It was so desperate, so wildly inaccurate, that I could already picture the look on the city clerk's face when they read it. I didn't even need to call anyone this time. The city's response came 2 days later. It was a curt, one-page letter stating that not only were no violations found, but that the complainant had submitted false claims under a non-existent code, which could be considered administrative misuse. They offered me the option to file a formal complaint against her for harassment under city statute. I didn't do it, not yet, but I kept the letter and made a copy, then casually laminated it and placed it next to the sculpture in the yard for passers-by to enjoy. Meanwhile, the county ombudsman had received every scrap of evidence forwarded by neighbors, board members, and even the retired city officer who had once signed off on my property exemption. Karen hadn't just targeted me. She'd built a long, colorful trail of overreach and intimidation that extended back nearly a decade. She had threatened people into removing holiday decorations, fined elderly residents for fence discoloration, and even sent warnings about lawn chairs being left out overnight. None of it had legal basis. It was all fear and fake authority. And now that trail was leading her straight into a hearing. Sandra, now acting HOA President, paid me another visit, this time with 2 board members in tow. They wanted to apologize in person and thank me for exposing the rot. They told me that Karen had manipulated meeting minutes, issued notices without board consent, and even tried to block new members from joining who didn't share her aesthetic values. They handed me an official letter from the HOA board stating that I was completely and permanently exempt from all future notices and activity by Willow Creek HOA. I thanked them, but the real victory was in the way the neighborhood had changed. People were talking again, gardening together, walking across property lines without fear of citations. It felt like the place had come alive for the first time since I'd moved in. But there was still one more twist to come. About a week later, a large moving truck appeared in front of Karen's house. No one had seen her in days. The blinds were drawn tight and the lights rarely on. Rumors swirled, and someone mentioned she'd put the house up for sale quietly through a private agency. I wasn't surprised. After everything that had happened, staying here would have meant facing a community that now saw through her completely. The woman who once ruled by fear had become a pariah. I watched from my porch as boxes were loaded. One of the movers struggled with a heavy plastic storage tub. The lid popped off, and I couldn't help but notice the corner of a laminated HOA rule binder poking out from under some dusty Christmas lights. It was a fitting end. She left without saying goodbye. No knock at my door, no final speech, not even a passive-aggressive glance. Just gone. Like a failed ghost trying to haunt a house that had already moved on. The next day, a handwritten sign appeared in her now empty yard. For sale by owner, quiet neighborhood, strong community, great neighbors. The irony nearly knocked me off the porch swing. A few weeks later, the house was sold. The new owner was a retired metal sculptor named Dean, who drove up in a truck with flame decals and wore sunglasses even at dusk. Within a week, he'd painted the shutters bright orange, installed a Kinetic fountain shaped like a spiral galaxy, and planted cacti in metal planters that looked like robots. Not a single person complained. Not even one. In fact, the board sent him a welcome basket with a note that read, "Glad you're here. We've had enough rules for a while." I invited Dean over for a neighborhood cookout, and as we grilled burgers under the soft glow of string lights, he asked about the rooster sculpture. I told him the whole story, start to finish. He laughed so hard he nearly dropped his plate. "She tried to HOA a man outside the HOA," he said between chuckles. "She picked the wrong outlaw." That night, as the last of the guests left and the fire pit crackled low, I sat back in my chair, looking out at the neighborhood. A few kids rode by on bikes waving. One gnome, freshly painted by a neighbor's daughter, had a tiny superhero cape now. It flapped gently in the breeze. The rooster's head spun with a soft clink as the wind passed. The place had personality again. It had color, noise, laughter. Karen's reign had been scrubbed away not by yelling or lawsuits, but by truth, unity, and a refusal to conform for conformity's sake. I never wanted to be the guy who made a point. I just wanted to enjoy my odd little corner of the world without being harassed for it. But somehow, in saying no to one woman's grip on power, I'd helped an entire street remember what it was like to live freely. No fines. No fear. Just community. And if someday someone else tries to swing a clipboard around and tell us what's wrong with our gardens, our chairs, our gnomes, or our paint colors, well, they'll have a lot more than one guy to deal with. They'll face a neighborhood that knows better now. One that knows what it looks like to stand together. And maybe, just maybe, they'll think twice before assuming everyone's afraid to push back.